Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans, that was it, the 2023 Brazilian Grand Prix. Max Verstappen has also won this race, season win number 17 for the Red Bull driver, 17 out of 20, giving him a win rate of 85%. This means that even if he doesn't win the last two races, he will still have a win rate of 77% in the 2023 Formula One season in the worst case scenario, which means he will definitely beat the old record set by Alberto Ascari, who won 75% of all races in 1952. For a very short time, it looked as if Lando Norris could cause Max Verstappen a few problems. After the restart, Lando Norris was really close to the DRS window, but it was never really enough to overtake Max Verstappen, and in the end he still had to settle for second place, 8 seconds behind. 8 seconds to second place, something Mercedes could only have dreamed of. Lewis Hamilton was 1 minute, 2 seconds, 859 thousandths of a second behind when he crossed the finish line. If you include the race interruption at the start, that's an average of 1 second per lap that Mercedes lost to Max Verstappen. That's roughly what you've already seen in the sprint, 1 second per lap, and that's obviously a decent number. Nevertheless, Mercedes said, well, we expected that after the disastrous sprint, so no improvement in the race either. Of course, they could have started from the pit lane, but they didn't know exactly what to change, and they had reasonably acceptable starting positions. It wasn't a situation like Aston Martin in the last few races, where they said, we've got nothing to lose anyway, we'll just rebuild the car and then start the race like that. No, it wasn't like that at Mercedes, and that's why the problems weren't unexpected. George Russell was hit even harder. He didn't even make it to the finish. He had to retire. Was the battle with his own teammate possibly even to blame? We once again saw Lewis Hamilton against George Russell, just like in Suzuka, just like in Qatar. This time they didn't crash into each other's cars, but things got really heated on the radio. Russell wanted to know from his team, are we actually racing together now, or are we racing our own races? So he wanted DRS from Lewis Hamilton, who then pulled away. In the end, it wouldn't have mattered at all. Mercedes had such an inferior pace that not only Sergio Perez flew past, but also Lance Stroll, Carlos Sainz, and even Pierre Gasly in the Alpine at the end. So that was a very bitter number. Now I've said that Russell had to retire, possibly because of the duel with Lewis Hamilton. Why do I say that? He had to retire his Mercedes because the engine was overheating. In between, we heard a radio message from his race engineer that the engine was possibly overheating because it was in overtake mode too often. If George Russell drives so close behind Lewis Hamilton and then possibly calls up the power, then that's not necessarily good for the whole system. Toto Wolff, the head of Mercedes Motorsport, had no problem with the duel, with the team internal duel, and with the radio messages. He was simply really affected by the performance. He said afterwards that it was the worst weekend in 13 years, that is, since Toto Wolff has been at Mercedes. Toto Wolff sometimes exaggerates a bit when it comes to negative feelings, but in this case you can probably buy it because Mercedes has rarely delivered such a desolate performance. Toto Wolff also followed that up, saying that this car didn't deserve to win. Mercedes, the Black Silver Arrows, are now faced with three big conundrums after this race. On the one hand, it was obvious that they lacked top speed. They had too much drag on the F1W14. They put a slightly larger wing on it, but they had hoped to at least be good in the corners and save the tires. But exactly the opposite was the case. They were slow on the straights, as expected, but were no faster in the corners. They slid around and pushed the tires much harder than the competition. Ferrari, for example, handled the tires much better than Mercedes. What was the reason for that? You can't really explain it. The second big puzzle is why things suddenly went so much worse in Sao Paulo. You were driving the same car that you had in Mexico and that you also had in Austin. Then the update to the floor came, everything went wonderfully. You were sometimes first in pursuit of Verstappen, were really close, and now all of a sudden you're in no man's land. You no longer understand the world. And the third big puzzle is why in Brazil, of all places? Things went so well there last season. Victory in the sprint, 1-2 in the Grand Prix. That was the only race where the Mercedes worked really well. And then a year later you come back and nothing works at all. If you want to look at it positively, last year it was precisely this victory that was so devastating for the direction of development, because the concept was held on to a little longer. In the meantime, we know it was the wrong concept. Now, in any case, the direction of development, which has been clear for some time at Mercedes, is going in a completely different direction, so completely in the direction of Red Bull, I would assume. Toto Wolff also said that this was definitely confirmed again today. Now, you might be asking yourself, sprint races, there was something 2 weeks ago in Aston. Lewis Hamilton was disqualified, and it is possible that this lack of Mercedes performance is linked to this disqualification, as they only had one free practice session in Brazil to set up the car, and above all, to adjust the car's ground clearance. Did Mercedes take an extremely conservative approach after the experience in Aston, preferring to set the car a little too high and lose a little performance to avoid the risk of being disqualified again? Toto Wolff says yes, that was perhaps still part of it, so yes, of course it is in the back of our minds, and we have already driven the car a little higher, but that doesn't explain the entire gap. Nevertheless, you definitely shouldn't underestimate this factor, because we've often said this season, or in this era, in this ground effect era, that ground clearance is the #1 performance driver in a car like this. By the way, as a nice side note, we looked at the FIA documents, which were checked after the race. The floorwear, i.e. the planks, was not on Joe Bauer's list. Now let's go from a disastrous performance by Mercedes to a really great performance by both Sergio Perez and, of course, Fernando Alonso. Sergio Perez, who showed a good recovery from 9th on the grid. Fernando Alonso first with a relatively weak start. Both Aston Martins didn't really get away at either start, but then at the second start, a duel worth seeing between Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. Alonso got past Hamilton straight away and was able to hold on to third place really, really well. He was even able to easily match the pace of Verstappen and Norris at the front, at least in the first stint. Yes, and then Sergio Perez came up from behind, and it became clear that it was going to be a really great duel between Perez and Alonso. Some of us in the editorial team thought it was just a formality until Perez passed, but it went on for a really, really, really long time. It was a really great duel, and a duel that was also wonderful to watch from the driver's perspective. Fernando Alonso kept choosing different lines, especially in turns 11 and 12, which was wonderful to see, and later he also revealed why. On the one hand, of course, it's important to protect the tires, and then, especially in this last real corner towards the full throttle passage, it's important to take the tires really gently, but at the same time not really lose traction, because you lose a lot of time on the long straight, and Fernando Alonso really did that par excellence, but at the same time he changed this line every now and then. Why? He told us later that he didn't want to give Sergio Perez any indication of how he was behaving. On the one hand, so that he can never get into it somehow, because he knows that Alonso will do this or that anyway, and on the other hand, so that he can't always choose the other line behind him in order to be in fresh air, to protect the tires, to have a car with better airflow. So Fernando Alonso, a fox, was really wonderful to watch. Then on lap 70, on the penultimate lap, Sergio Perez actually went past in turn 1. It looked as if Fernando Alonso had lost the podium position, but then once again they did the math without this old fox. He fought back on the last lap and got the better of Perez again. He made a very small mistake in turn 1. Alonso then didn't take the chance in turn 1, but simply drove the racing line through the Senna S, and then turn du Sol, and then a very, very exciting duel between the two on the straight towards turn 4. It was incredibly fair. Neither of them gave up a millimeter, and there was no contact. Alonso got past and then won the sprint from the last corner to the finish line. So that was a heart-stopping final for this podium position. Both were satisfied afterwards. Fernando Alonso, of course, he took the podium, a long-awaited result for Aston Martin after being somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Lance Stroll also had a great race in 5th position, but Perez was also satisfied. He said it was a great duel, it was really fair. So the motorsport heart, that must really open up in someone, and Perez has consolidated 2nd place in the Drivers' World Championship a little again. Big points for him. We've just talked about Lewis Hamilton, who only finished 8th. So that was definitely a good race weekend for Sergio Perez, and he has also really redeemed himself in terms of performance. But now we need you. You can write videos, you can host videos, maybe you can edit videos. If you can do at least one of these things, then we would be delighted if you applied for a job with us. The whole thing full-time in our office in Graz. Either you already have professional experience and join us directly, or you look at the whole thing with an internship with us. Important, at least 6 months, as we both want to benefit from each other and get to know each other. All information is available at jobs.motorsportmagazine.com. Then we move on from a wonderful thing, namely our team, to a less wonderful thing, namely Charles Leclerc. At Ferrari, everything was geared towards the race Sunday. They had chosen a cooling setup that was anything but optimal in the sprint, lift and coast to excess. They knew it would be colder on race Sunday, so the setup was perfect for Sunday. At the same time, they saved tires. In sprint qualifying, in the shootout, they didn't even put on a fresh set of soft tires, even though they still had one, because they said they wanted a fresh set of soft tires for the race. This starting position in the sprint is not so important to us. But we want to start from second place on the grid in the race, which we had this second place on the grid. We want to go there with fresh softs. We want to secure a good starting position, all for nothing. Charles Leclerc didn't even make it back onto the grid. He flew off in turn 6 on the formation lap. That looked pretty stupid at first. Charles Leclerc then said on the radio that the hydraulics were to blame, but at the same time wanted to know why he always has so much bad luck. So why he has so much bad luck, unfortunately we can't answer that question for him. Of course, it's a recurring theme throughout his season. The retirement in the very first race, then the penalty in the second race, then just recently the disqualification in Aston when he had actually started from pole position. So things can't get much worse, but he says himself that if he's going to have so much bad luck, it's going to be in a season where there's not much at stake anyway, rather than in a season where he's fighting at the front. But of course, he would prefer to have no bad luck at all. Can we now answer the question of what was going on, why he crashed? Is it true that it was the hydraulics? Was it perhaps a driving error? We can definitely rule out driving error. He really wasn't fast enough to fly off like that. But it probably wasn't the hydraulics. It just felt like that because the hydraulics were gone. However, according to team boss Fred Vasseur, the electronics were responsible for this, as they shut down the systems. First the hydraulics, that's why he had no power steering, that's how he felt it, that's how he got to the hydraulics in the first place. Then the engine also shut down. If the engine is switched off while driving, then of course the rear axle locks, you have no chance. So he spun out, hit the track barrier, and was then able to restart the system. You can now start a Formula One car with the MG UK. So not in the meantime, but quite a while ago restarted the car. But then after 15 seconds, he had the same problems again. And so his race was over before it had even started. He says that the only thing that would motivate him now would be second place in the Constructors' Championship. He hopes that Ferrari still has a chance after this race. After Mercedes did anything but cover themselves in glory, Carlos Sainz was able to pull the coals out of the fire for Ferrari and make up 2 points, leaving him 20 points behind Mercedes with 2 races to go before the end of the season. Charles Leclerc then had the presence of mind to park the Ferrari in a small pocket so that the race could be restarted without delay, but then it was immediately stopped again. Major accident at the start between Alexander Albon and the 2 Haas drivers. Albon made a great start and dashed to the front, went to the outside. Kevin Magnussen also made a very, very good start on the inside, and then Nico Hülkenberg was left in the middle with a relatively mediocre start and was sandwiched in. Kevin Magnussen tried to push his teammate away a bit, wanted to maintain his position. He didn't necessarily need to pull to the outside, but of course he didn't see Alexander Albon on the other side either. Nico Hülkenberg couldn't get out of the way, then slightly touched Alexander Albon, who in turn crashed into Kevin Magnussen. The Williams was really damaged. Kevin Magnussen's Haas was also really damaged. The crash barrier and the tire stacks were broken, so there was a longer red period to repair the whole thing. Luckily for Nico Hülkenberg, he had a puncture and a bit of damage, which could be repaired during the red period. The puncture was a bit annoying because it was his best set of tires, but to be honest, even with his best set of tires, not much would have worked in this race. 12th position for him, the only ones he was able to keep behind him were Daniel Ricciardo and Oscar Piastri. Why was he able to keep them behind him? Because they were also the victims of the collision at the start. Daniel Ricciardo got hit by a tire which flew onto his rear wing, so he had to take a long break for repairs and started the race a lap down. The same applies to Oscar Piastri. Kevin Magnussen spun off and caught Piastri on the rear, causing damage to the Australian's McLaren, and he also started the race a lap down, so no chance for him. In the snail race at the back, it got really exciting again because Yuki Tsunoda scored 2 points again. Now AlphaTauri is actually coming towards the Williams. That will be really exciting again. And behind them, Alpha could not benefit from all this chaos. Alpha Sauber could not benefit from all this chaos. Double DNF, both had to park their cars. Why? They didn't want to tell us. Supposedly they themselves don't know what was going on. But at least they had the sensor data, otherwise they wouldn't have withdrawn both. So poor communication from Alpha Sauber. Xavier Pujolar didn't want to tell us either, a bit of a shame. But of course Haas also went out without points again. There now seem to be 2 duels at the back. AlphaTauri against Williams and Haas against Alpha Sauber. There's nothing to give away at the back because every place in the Constructors' Championship brings many, many millions. But hopefully you have something to give away and it won't cost you millions either. How about a wonderful print subscription, not for yourself but for your loved ones? Christmas is just around the corner and you can get a gift voucher for exactly 1 year's print edition of Motorsport-Magazin. Very important. If you give this subscription as a gift, you don't run the risk of being caught in some subscription trap. No, you give exactly 1 year of this wonderful print subscription. You can find the link in the video description below, and I would be delighted if many of you out there in this motorsport world would give this as a gift.